Now, next up, do you remember the reports last month about China developing a new hypersonic nuclear-enabled missile that was able to circumnavigate the world and strike? It turns out we were told that American intelligence were quite surprised by how advanced the Chinese technology were because they were more advanced than the Americans themselves. In this week's magazine, Andrew Cockburn casts some doubts on this, arguing that the West has got a little bit carried away with how advanced China might be. He joins me now, as does my colleague Cindy Yu. Andrew, why aren't you worried about this? Because the Chinese obviously do have the technology. So what's to say that they have not actually overtaken America and Russia with this new hypersonic glide technology that everybody is trying to develop?
Well, there's a number of reasons. They used to say in the Pentagon, talk about weapons that don't work to meet threats that don't exist. And this is a shining example of that. But first of all, there are inherent reasons why a hypersonic missile, which I should quickly say simply means something that travels at more than 5 times the speed of sound, is not a very sort of worthwhile weapon of war, because the whole point is that it should glide along. It's boosted into orbit by a rocket, just like any space vehicle, but then is released just at the top of the atmosphere and basically given an almighty shove by the rocket, and then flies through the atmosphere toward its target, maneuvering, flying like an airplane. As an airplane, in fact. And the whole point of that is that therefore it's impossible to track, to know where it's going to be. With an ordinary ballistic missile, once it's set off and you can see where it's going, you know where it's going to be and you can intercept it, theoretically. And this gets around that. That's what's meant to be scary about it. Except that we don't have any defenses against ballistic missiles anyway. They've been trying for years. They spent $200 billion since Ronald Reagan unveiled the idea back in 1983, and they still have got almost nothing to show for it. They're still working on, still spending billions. So, there's nothing new. There's no new threat here. And by the way, in trying to reduce a complicated technological thing to brief sentences, in maneuvering through the atmosphere, the thing quickly loses energy. I mean, it's like, in the act of sort of turning or diving or climbing, it slows down.
So Cindy, if it's useless, then why is the Chinese government spending so much money on it?
I think we have to look at where else in the world is doing it, because it's not just the Chinese and the Americans, it's also the Russians, as Andrew points out in his article. Putin has made this a key military facet since 2018, and the Chinese are following this. If you look at supersonic nuclear missile, if you search that in a Chinese search engine, most of the articles that come up are about how ahead the Russians are. So I do think we have to take that into account, that to China, great power competition isn't just about America, it's also about the other big beasts in the world. And Fraser, just to go back to your point before about Chinese military capability being better than the Americans, on ballistic and cruise missiles, they are, but just on that. And the reason for that is because of China's geography. It's surrounded by countries in a way that America is not, or countries potentially that you might have conflict with. And so it has concentrated on that part of its capability in a way that America doesn't have to. So on that point, it is better than Americans, but that doesn't mean the whole military as a whole is better than Americans. It still only spends less than a third of the US defense budget on its own defense, even though the army is much larger.
Andrew, isn't that a decent point? When you look at the world's great defence spenders, China is pretty small. I mean, your average NATO country is supposed to spend 2% of GDP on defence. Now, Britain does, France more or less, but most of them don't. But China is something like 1.7, so this does not look like a country which is really budgeting for conflict in the way that we tend to see in the build-up to wars.
Well, this is true. And in fact, I think it's the case, they still spend more on their internal security apparatus for keeping the Chinese people under control, the People's Armed Police and a huge apparatus of censorship and all the rest. They spend more on that than they do on their external military. So all this tub thumping that we see in the press, with like the hypersonic missiles we're discussing, should be seen in that context. It looks like they see a bigger threat from their own people than they do from any external enemy.
But what about the military build-up on the Taiwanese coast there? I mean, that can't be an internal threat. I mean, that's right now that is the number one focus of American attention. And the understanding in Washington and in London is that China, if it wanted to, could make an assault on Taiwan pretty quickly. It doesn't need missiles for that. It just needs boats to go a few miles over the sea and annex currently sovereign territory.
Well, it's very easy to, once you sort of put all that in one sentence, it all makes it sound quite easy. But, they've got, we in 1944, the Allies took an enormous effort to move an invading army 20 miles across the Channel, or slightly more than 20 miles. But the Chinese to go to Taiwan is 100 miles. They'd need more than 2 amphibious ships, which is all they have at the moment. Amphibious support ships. They probably might need more than 2. Well, I think they're heading for 4 aircraft carriers. I think one they converted into a hotel, but never mind. I mean, it's just a very silly idea. I mean, that they keep saying that we don't think we could do this. It's worth looking at what the Chinese say about themselves in the Chinese literature, and they keep sort of complaining that the troops aren't properly trained, don't know how to use the weapons, that the whole thing's been disorganized. They haven't done a major exercise since I think 2017. And as for these, incursions into Taiwanese airspace that we read so much about in the press, if you look at the map of where the planes actually went, they basically go along one side of this self-declared air defense identification zone, which is not national airspace, and fly along it, maybe one plane a day, sometimes many more, but most of the time one plane, then go home again. It looks more like training flights. In fact, the Taiwanese chief of staff said the other day that's what they were.
So Cindy, how do you see this? The Chinese people seem to take reasonable pride in the military. China still has military parades where the latest weapons are put on display here. I mean, do they regard military spending as a waste of money or something that an up-and-coming nation needs in order to stake its claim to be the power in the region? That certainly seems to be, as you've written before, this is what Xi wants. He wants to be the top dog in Asia. For that, he will need a military capable of projecting if he chooses to do so.
Yeah, Fraser, I think it is much more about national pride, and I think people are happy to spend this much money. And the dynamics that Andrew picks out in this military-industrial complex that happens in America happens in China too, because once you big up the threat coming from places like America, as a Chinese person, you're going to want to defend yourself from that. Or you want to protect your territorial claims, for example, in the South China Sea, or Fraser, you said Taiwan, which I would argue that the Chinese do see as an internal problem, as we know that they argue about that. So for things like that, either it's for defense or for securing your own interests in its near abroad, as it were. The Chinese are quite happy to spend money on that. And some of it is not, so the People's Liberation Army has been undergoing modernization. Some of it is not about spending more, it's just about spending more cleverly. It's about reorganizing, it's about spending less on the army, more on the navy, more on the space force. That sort of rejigging, which is something that President Xi has very much been looking at. But one thing that they've been lacking still is this kind of capability to have joint missions. So to take Taiwan, you need to have air, sea and land operating together. And at the moment, the Chinese are still not quite there yet with that. So you can see in the curriculum in military academies where they're still kind of figuring out what is the right approach to teach its students. So yeah, on that joint capability part, no amount of money is going to be able to fix that in the short term.